He's a professor of contemporary Arab studies at the Harvard Department of Anthropology. And his recent work is focused on the water crisis facing Yemen. And when I did the research on this, there's a quote that I really enjoyed, so I thought I'd share it with you as to the purpose of my work. It says, "And if the problems of water might not be solved exactly, perhaps we will find a way to alleviate some of the worst suffering caused by it, not the least being political conflicts." And Dr. Caton has graciously agreed to incorporate a human right to water into his talk tonight, so we're very much looking forward to it.
Thank you. Well, yes, you know, you agree to do these things that you're not used to working on, and the deadline is months away, and you think, oh, I've got all the time in the world, and last night I panicked. I had to actually Google the words. I, oh my God, is that what I committed myself to? So I'll do my best, not really knowing how you've been thinking about rights. I'm curious to see what your reaction is in terms of my conceptualization of it, which is, I'm going at it really from more of an ethnographic and not at all from a theoretical position. So as many of you know, Yemen is facing a severe water shortage. Thomas Friedman, in an op-ed piece in last Sunday's Sunday New York Times, actually referred to Yemen and its water problems and the mismanagement, supposed mismanagement of Arab regimes of their water resources as perhaps being yet another factor in the Arab Spring. What I would like to do is present a rather different view of those regimes and suggest that in fact they are grappling in a very profound way about the challenges facing their water situations. I'm going to talk about one kind of response to this, and that is from the world of water experts. I have been working on this for several years now, since at least 2005. I went to Yemen at that time to try and train some Yemeni sociologists to do anthropological field work, and part of the course was a practicum where we went to Sana'a, the capital city, which is very much the old city as you remember it, and I remember it from the early 1980s, except now it's a city of 2.5 million, and it's the fastest growing city in the Middle East, perhaps even in the world. It's astonishing. These students selected different water sites to work on, to do field work. And they were really quite wonderful. So one student worked on these old gardens that were vegetable gardens attached to the mosques and were irrigated with water that was used in the ablution, so gray water. And many of these gardens now are withering because the well water is drying up. There's no way to irrigate these any longer. Another student worked on industrial and also hospital water pollution and where it was being diverted and who was suffering as a result. Another student worked on the migration into the city and the pressure that this was building in the peri-urban areas, especially on water use. Someone else worked on questions of gender and how this affected their position really in the workplace. And I wondered, well, what would I work on? And so, willy-nilly, I ended up working on the water experts, trying to figure out what they thought they were doing and whether they were helping the situation or actually hindering it, and how one would even know. So I spent my time and made friends with some, with engineers, with water chemists, with legal experts, political scientists, and so forth, all of whom had come to Yemen from scattered areas in the world to collectively, collaboratively, understand the dimensions of the problem and what, if anything, could be done about it. So that's basically the field work, which also took me away from Yemen to international venues such as engineering schools in Holland, where a new kind of knowledge, supposedly new kind of knowledge, integrated water resource management, was being taught, and Yemeni engineers were now instructed in so that they could properly manage water resources in their own country. So I followed these experts to those universities to talk about the curriculum and how that emerged, and how this new philosophy of water management was itself embedded in a very complicated national politics and transnational politics. What I want to talk about today is not the present moment, but a moment in the mid-1990s, which was a crucial time in Yemen, as it will become clear. And this was a time when Yemen began to experience a tremendous urban growth, unprecedented, really. Sana'a, we've just said, expanded from a city of about 750,000 to a city now well over 2.5 million people. The central city of Taiz in the highlands of Yemen is now a city of probably even larger at this point. The coastal city of Al-Hodeida on the Red Sea coast is now well over 1 million. I'm not sure what the population of Aden is, but it is also grown. And not surprisingly, these cities have faced difficulty provisioning sufficient and safe drinking water for its inhabitants. So Taiz, for example, during this period, the municipality experienced a drawdown so severe in its water supply that it could only provision water for a couple of hours on a daily basis, and there was a whole week, actually a week to 10 days that went by when no water came out of the taps at all.
Can I ask a question about what was leading to this massive increase in the urban areas? Was it migration from rural areas to the urban areas? And,
Yes.
and do you have the phenomenon of people living in kind of squatter type situations where they don't actually have access to piped network?
Yes, as you'll see, one of the problems is the collapse or the near collapse of the agricultural system, because there was simply not enough water left any longer to supply the crops, and so farmers abandoned their fields and either migrated to relatives who had a better water situation in another wadi, or they went to the cities where they sought off-farm work. With very few skills, marginal literacy, you can imagine that these were not high-paying jobs. They were taxi drivers, they were guards, security guards sometimes. They occupied the lowest rung in the service sector imaginable, and they led very marginal lives. I wouldn't say that they necessarily occupied urban slum areas. Many of them had tribal relatives who were better off and longer established in the cities with whom they lived, but often again in a kind of subservient and sometimes humiliating position. And the second part of the question was, or did I cover it?
So people had access to piped, there may not have been water coming through the pipes, but people generally were in some kind of living situation where there would have actually been piped access.
Yes, I mean, no one died of thirst, but you had to pay for your water, for the most part, through water trucks that came into the city. And sometimes these poorer households were paying a huge fraction of their income just to have enough water to drink, let alone for domestic purposes. So this situation in Taiz naturally produced a panic, and people tried to break in the municipal water supplies. which may or may not have been contaminated. Luckily, no epidemics broke out. A similar thing happened in the coastal city of El Hodeida, where water ran out and people panicked. And in fact, the army, the military, had to come in to restore calm. Now, the government at this time that was responsible for water provisioning was Noura. Hi. The National Water Resource Authority. What, we don't have a blackboard here?
When we have a whiteboard, we can get them.
Well, would it be helpful if I wrote these acronyms down? I mean, at this, which now is subsumed under the Ministry of Water and the Environment, which still exists now in Yemen. And they had to, Noura had to figure out how to bring water from the hinterland to the cities, because the cities were running out of water. So to do so, it hired 4 consultants. This is now in 1996. We're not talking about the present time. It hired 4 consultants, including an engineer and team leader by the name of Dr. Mohammed Al-Iriani. Mohammed Al-Iriani is a highly trained engineer. He has a engineering degree from the United States. He's from a very powerful political and technocratic family in Yemen. His uncle, Abdul Karim al-Iriani, is arguably Yemen's most senior and distinguished statesman. He eventually became Minister of Water in the early 2000s. So he became a key figure, one of 2 or 3 key figures in the water world in Yemen. And also a legal consultant, Dr. Salah Hada, whom I've never met and I know nothing about. And there was also an agroeconomist and a water management expert. Together, they wrote for Noura a report. And as an anthropologist studying experts and their knowledge, this report is for me an ethnographic datum. And it is also by now an historical document. That is, the responses to the water pressures discussed in it have by now been superseded. But this makes it no less interesting for my purposes. So I'm trying to get a sense of the history of expert thinking about water in the country and how it has developed. Expert thinking that was Yemeni, not necessarily World Bank, JTZ, USAID. And how this has changed over time. In other words, to counter this rather simplistic notion that these governments were completely inactive or incompetent. These were highly competent individuals. And as you'll see, they were really struggling conceptually with the problem of rights in this report. The report is called Water Right Aspects, not the best English, but Water Right Aspects of the Proposed Sources for the Sana'a Water Supply. Let me just explain something before I take your question. So what they mean here is that Noura had on the table a number of different proposals, quite detailed, for bringing water from the hinterlands, in other words, the water basin of Sana'a, to the capital city. These were water transfer projects. And they were asking the question then, what are the legal implications of each of these proposals? And to get into that, they then had to get into an extended discussion about rights, particularly water rights. Yes, sir.
I don't know, this might not be a good time to ask, but are you going to touch again on the rural situation later on, or are you not going to?
No, I'm really talking about, I will, under the concept of tribal law.
Just to clarify one point from what you said before, so if I understood correctly, the migration to the cities was triggered by growing water scarcity in the rural areas, in part, where agriculture literally collapsed?
Well, no, not literally collapsed, but
declined.
There were, yes. It's a long story, and it's going to divert me somewhat from this question of rights, but very quickly, in the 1980s, what happened in Yemen, has happened in many developing countries, sort of the neoliberal development order said, we can no longer give money to the governments to dispense to no doubt worthy projects, because governments are corrupt, they're inefficient, and they're not transparent in the way this money is doled out. So we have to change things around. And furthermore, we have to figure out what parts of your economy can be capitalized so that you can join the world market, you can make money, and that will reduce your dependency on development dollars. Well, Yemen's only real, at that time, this was before oil, but that's another story. Yemen's only real capital, as it were, was in its agricultural system. And so money was poured into that through various sources. The World Bank gave low-interest loans to farmers to buy artesian drills, tube well drilling, so that they could drill for water deep down into the aquifer. And what the experts didn't know, although it's hard to imagine that they didn't, one suspects there was a political blindness here, was that these aquifers contained fossil water, and so water was being drawn out that wasn't being recharged. And eventually the water table dropped so precipitously that very few, except the wealthiest farmers, could drill that far down to get the water out, and even then it wasn't of very good quality. There were various efforts to shift to different kinds of crops which were not as water thirsty, but these were not necessarily crops that were on demand on the world market. So real incomes dropped. And many people, lost their homes, their farms, whatever, and then had to go with their families to seek work elsewhere in the cities. It's a long, complicated story, but that's sort of how this had developed. But it kind of takes us away from, I'm being so good about getting us back to rights, right? To rights discourses. So, I don't want to sound like a geographic determinist, but there is something really important about Yemen's geography, and especially Sana's location, that you have to bear in mind when you try to understand its water situation. So Sana'a is, about between 7,000 and 10,000 feet above sea level. It's higher by far than Denver, okay? And we're talking about a very rugged mountainscape, very difficult terrain to traverse. And this in turn constrained how the government could respond to the city's water needs. For cities on the coast like Al-Hodeida and Aden, it was fairly simple, though not inexpensive. That's water desalination, right? So water desalination plants, not many, just 2, I think, maybe even only 1 at that time, were built. And water was literally manufactured for those cities. But for the highlands, it's impossible to pump that water up that many feet, or to use tankers to ship that water. Water's heavy and therefore very expensive. So it was economically unfeasible. So you couldn't transfer it from the coast to the interior, a solution that is relatively straightforward for the Gulf states, where terrain is perfectly flat, right? And you manufacture the water and you put in the pipes and then you straight to Riyadh, this is just not going to happen in case of Yemen's highland cities. So the only way that that Sana'a, for example, could augment its water supplies was to figure out a way to transfer the water from those wadis that still had some water, either below ground, which was looking less and less probable, though the picture wasn't clear. It's still not clear, actually, how severe the down draw has been, or through water flowing above ground or contained above ground through water catchment systems like dams and weirs and so forth, and cisterns. Now, there are different ways that water can be obtained, which, and again, I'm going to sound like a horrible determinist, but which is partly a factor of water's materiality, the physics of its flow. So, water flows in floods brought on by seasonal rains in Yemen in April and March, April, and then again in August and September. And this water literally comes rushing down the mountainsides and then is caught in various kinds of dams and cisterns and then diverted across the land through floodwater irrigation. Or it can be obtained from below ground, groundwater. And this was relatively uncommon in the days before the pump. Hand wells were usually hand dug, and they were usually only used for drinking purposes. In extreme cases of drought, people used these wells to augment the water in their fields, but it was relatively uncommon. But in modern times, that is after 1980 roughly, the artesian well became far more ubiquitous, and this allowed the farmers to augment the water supply greatly. Both of these kinds of materialities of water, the writers of this document propose, face different legal challenges, and this is what they're trying to work through. Now, in Yemen, there is no uniform or unambiguous legal framework with which to talk about any kind of rights, let alone water rights. As in many Muslim countries, there are at least three sources of law or legal systems. Sharia, based on the Quran and the Sunnah, are the sayings and practices of the Prophet, as reported by his contemporaries or near contemporaries, according to certain certified transmissions. Civil law, which is called Qanun in Arabic, which is an invention really of what we could loosely call the modern period. These were laws that the state developed, in theory never contradicting Sharia, but which accounted for phenomena that Sharia only awkwardly could address. So new kinds of inventions, particularly in the commercial field, required new kinds of legal discourse that Qanun was invented for. And then there's, of course, in Yemen in particular, customary law, or urf, as it's called, U-R-F. And I'll talk about each of these in a moment. So Noura's consultants in this document asked two sets of interesting questions. They asked what would be entailed physically and socially in water transfers. And I like the fact that they were very cognizant of the social question, because often engineers approach these in purely technocratic and logical terms. And they were, maybe you have to, no Yemeni would ever assume that a technological solution would be it's a sufficient approach to anything in life. So they were very attuned to the social implications of water transfers. But they also focused on the legal implications. So with regard to the physical transfers, the consultants were concerned with the source of the water. Was it above ground and flowing across the surface, or was it below ground and tapped from wells? They were concerned with the majra, the transportation, I suppose, or the diversion of the water from its source to other geographic points, which in this case would be Sana'a. And thirdly, they were concerned with hurma, with protecting the water source and protecting its transportation to its eventual destination. So each of these proposals, they said, entailed at least these three concerns. Where is it coming from, and can you maintain that integrity of the water supply, both in terms of quantity and quality? Where is it going to, and can you transport it in an efficient and conservation-minded way so that you lose as little as possible through evaporation or any kind of water loss through bad pipes? And finally, protecting both the water source and its eventual distribution from, harm of one sort or another. So I want to, one could spend a lot of time on both of these, but for the purposes of this talk, mindful that this is a workshop on rights, I'm going to focus on the legal implications of these water transfers. So let's first talk about the right of access to water. So, as I said, there are three legal systems at work, Sharia, Qanun, and Urf, and they all have something to say about water access as a right. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, they are not consistent with each other on this point. So the Yemeni constitution is quite aggressive, actually, on this point. It establishes access to sufficient and clean drinking water as a fundamental right of Yemeni citizens. This is actually stated in the Constitution. So, this Constitution was written in the 1960s. Already at that time, the authorities were aware of the centrality of water to the definition of the Yemeni citizen, and the need for the country to protect water. Article 8 of the Constitution goes further in that it establishes water as the property of the state, and as such in the public domain. Therefore, the corollary is that the state is responsible for overseeing the utilization of this resource, as it is other essential resources, for the public welfare. And every citizen is guaranteed the right of access to drinking water at the very least. Well, as we've said, the Constitution is supposed to be in harmony with Sharia law. That is, the Constitution cannot contradict Sharia law, and accordingly, a stipulation of, this is stipulated actually in Article 1, quote, "This law is taken from Sharia law and applies to all its dealings." In other words, this law about the fundamental right of the citizen to access to clean and sufficient water. But what does the Sharia law actually say about water? This is where it gets more interesting. So there's a famous hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, and we're both embarrassed that we cannot remember the exact wording in Arabic, even though we pass ourselves off as Arabic scholars. But the Prophet Muhammad declared that, quote, "People are partners in three things: water, fire, and pasture." This is a very, very famous hadith. So people are partners in three things: water, fire, and pasture. You cannot deny a person either of these substances if they are in need of them. This would be a sin. Now, according to some jurists, this is interpreted as meaning that water is a publicly owned resource. It's part of the commons, and as such cannot be privately owned. Hence, all people, as well as the community as a whole, have the right of free access to water. Others have a different opinion, and I'll get to that below. Now, a person has a right to water in two instances only, however: for drinking, to relieve thirst, and for their animals, so that they won't die, because then, of course, you lose your livelihood. Furthermore, a suppliant for water may not demand water as his or her right if it leads to a greater harm of thirst or deprivation to the owner of the water's source. In other words, comparative harms in Sharia have to be weighed to see whether the right may be just. So if, for example, you are, suffering from thirst and you come across a man who has water, but that man in turn has to provide water to his family, that man can make the argument, I'm sorry for you, I feel very sorry for you, but I have to have this water for the well-being of my family, and I cannot give it to you. However, it is understood that people with a water surplus ought to make that water available to the thirsty wayfarer. And there's a very famous, I don't know if it's in many other countries, but there's a custom in Yemen called Ibn as-Sabil, the son of the way.
That's actually in the Quran.
Yeah?
Yeah, it has a Quran.
Yeah. The Ibn as-Sabil, the Sabil is the path or the way, so it's the wayfarer. And this is a tap, a water tap that taps into a water source, often connected to the mosque or to some wealthy person's house. And there's a cup attached to that tap, and the thirsty wayfarer can fill that water and relieve their thirst. And in theory, the owner, in fact, this is a meritorious act. The owner would hardly object. Now, it's interesting that as water becomes privatized and people depend on it being delivered to their homes and they're paying for it, the question often arises, well, there are some people here who really are destitute and we would never think of charging them for the water. But there are others who are passing by who could in fact pay for it. Why shouldn't they share the cost? And so now water is gradually being seen as a commodity. And this is actually posing interesting ethical and moral dilemmas about who does or does not have a right depending on their socioeconomic level. Civil law reflects this right of common access. Article 1366 says water is permitted for all to use. But Sharia law does not leave the question of water right at this. It allows for the possibility of private ownership of water that the Constitution does not, thus bringing the Constitution in contradiction with Sharia. Water that is enclosed in man-made receptacles, buckets or containers, that sets it apart from water's source may be privately owned or alienated from the commons, according to the Sharia. Yemen's civil law reflects this in direct contradiction of the Constitution, which, as I remind you, the water is owned by the state. And it's not as if the state is granting concessions to people to own it privately. Right? The state is saying, we own this water. But what does civil law say, following the Sharia, which it is supposed to do? Water is not owned as a private property except when transported or contained in receptacles or the like. For example, the drilling of a well to receive water is considered an appropriation by containment and hence ownership. So civil law is in harmony with Sharia, but, as the four consultants realized, in contradiction with the Yemeni constitution. So posing some real interesting legal conundrum. Now let's turn to urf, customary law. As in Sharia, water is considered a collectively owned resource, but it can be also privately owned. The important point, and this is very important when you're talking about water, is that water is connected to land. So whoever owns the land owns the water underneath it or around it. And water cannot be separated from the land. Ownership of water cannot be separated from ownership of the land. And in fact, if you buy land and you have a deed for that land, even if it is not stated that the water resource is connected to the land you own, it is understood as such. So it's not as if you can own land and then sell the land but retain your rights to the water on that land. That is impossible. These things go together. Orff also distinguishes between surface and groundwater. Groundwater is owned by whoever owns the land above it, and it can be used as the owner wishes, so it's private. Surface water is not so simple, and that is because it's often associated with irrigation on which everyone depends. Surface water must move across an expanse of land and irrigate different parcels on that land, which are usually owned by different individuals. And so equitable access of this flow of water must be assured to all who ultimately depend on the water from that source. And Orff has developed extraordinarily intricate schemes of time sharing or volume sharing, so that people who are closest to the water source, who have the riparian right of first access, nevertheless don't use up all of the good water, so that people downstream have nothing to work with. Yemen has had such a system in place now for God knows how long, thousands of years, arguably. So,
Is there,
yeah.
is there anything in any of these legal frameworks about injuring or poisoning water?
Yes, I mean, that would be considered a criminal offense.
So pollution is.
Well, intentional pollution is absolutely.
And damages.
Absolutely, yes. I'll get to this in a minute. The right to protect your water resource from potential harm, because so many people are dependent on it. And there are laws in place to presumably ensure that. I'll get to that in a minute. This question of pollution or contamination, possible pollution, because by the time it happens, it's too late. So what can you do to defend your water resource that is reasonable without that then preventing others having reasonable access to it? It's always this.
Can I ask a question about your interpretation of the Constitution? Because if you look in other parts of the world, the idea of state does not necessarily equal commons and actually vesting in people. And that you can have, there's examples, Philippines, or various parts of the world, where water, constitutional water will be owned by the state, but the state then serves as a trustee essentially, and can in fact delegate the service provision to another actor, and it's not necessarily, you may not be able to wholesale privatize it, but in terms of delegation of service is not necessarily compatible, and there's some political geographers and others that have written about this distinction between corporatization of water versus commons versus state ownership. And so I'm wondering is in terms of how it's written in the original Arabic, is the sense that the people that were doing this, they interpreted this really as state equals, it vests in the people, as opposed to state vesting in the state as trustee for the people.
Well, it is the latter in the sense that the state is understood as a supposedly democratically elected parliament and a democratically elected president that is ultimately accountable to the people. In theory, that was the hope of the Republic. So in that sense, it is not that the state owns the water and can do whatever it wants. It owns the water as a steward for the people to who are the ultimate beneficiaries of this resource. But one of the things that this question, which is an excellent one, spurs me to do is to think more carefully about this construction of the state and how this has shifted over time. So it gives me something to think about and to work with. I offhand cannot tell you, I cannot give you a good answer to that question. I'm speculating what the answer is, but I'm not absolutely certain. So I made note of it, and I'll try to tease it out.
And one more question actually about Sharia, which is my understanding was that the right of thirst for people was prominent, followed by the right of thirst for animals, but that there was actually a right of irrigation that was subservient to that. At least in some articles that I read have discussed that. Is that something that is prevalent?
It's not mentioned really in terms of the Zaydi madhab, which is the predominant one at this period in time. But I do recall that this question of the right to irrigation does come up. Over and over again, what is insisted upon is the right for access to water to alleviate thirst and for domestic purposes. So for hygiene, for cooking, and for prayer, really, for ablutions and prayer, though there are alternative substances, as we know, for that when water is unavailable. But irrigation is not necessarily seen. Access to water for irrigation is ordinarily something that's talked about in Uruf. And it's not surprising to me because the tribes are the great farmers in Yemen. We think of tribes as nomadic, and they are in the eastern region of the country, but the majority of tribes are sedentary and have been farmers for centuries, if not millennia. And so for them, they have a real vested interest in irrigation. Whereas many of the other ethnic groups in Yemen are highly urban-based and depend on tribal agricultural goods which they can purchase in their markets, but are not actually that heavily invested in agricultural labor themselves. So I think rights around irrigation are something that tribes really talk about the most. And that's how I understand it in the Yemeni context. So rights to access is only part of the problem that the Noura experts faced. They also had to talk about transport from the source to the city. And this then raised the question, what are the laws about water diversion? And here, Uruf was in fact the most illuminating. So this now gets you partly to your question. Not everyone can irrigate their lands at equidistance from the source. Often water has to be transported from the source across someone else's land to reach its rightful destination. So fields are not necessarily adjacent to water sources, and sometimes you own non-adjacent fields. So for you to irrigate a field that is non-adjacent to yourself, you may have to have right of access. What do we call it? Leeway? Or no, in our own system. Easements. I remember my father owned a farm in southern Illinois. He was always complaining about how exorbitant the easement was. The state, in collusion with the power companies, was forcing them, blah, blah, blah. But, this isn't the state. It's negotiated rights to access across land with the purpose of irrigating your own water because of the importance of this to your livelihood. And this is again enshrined in the civil law. It says the owner of a land which is located in between the water source and the land to be irrigated should permit passage of the necessary pipes to transport the water in exchange for fair compensation to be paid in advance. And again, if a property is damaged due to water transport pipes, then the property owner may claim compensation from the benefactor. For the Noura experts, these were precedents for the legal argument that the government has the right to divert water across other people's lands if necessary, as long as they are properly compensated. So far, we've examined the rights with respect to the sources of water and its transport, but the NURA consultants also felt it essential to address the question of water protection, especially the question of quality. Sharia law actually says that a well must be protected in a radius equivalent to its depth so that its water will not be contaminated. And in Urf, the rule of thumb is that is the 500-meter rule between wells. So you cannot either dig a well closer to in a 500 meter radius to your well, nor could you erect any kind of structures that could arguably be said to harm or contaminate the water resource. So there were again precedents for NURA in insisting on protecting water supplies for which they were responsible. It could build special structures at the source as long as these structures were not damaging or harming the water resource. And these protective devices could also be employed for water transport across other people's lands. So much for the legal precedents regarding rights to water access, transport, and protection. The next problem the NURA consultants faced was this, and remember, they're engineers. There was more than one way to bring water from the hinterland basins to the cities, and the question was, what would be the legal implications of each of these? So if NURA piped water from underground, it owed the people who owned these lands compensation, because they owned this water underground. If NURA bought the lands outright, which is not an easy thing to do, the state, of course, would have ownership of the water, which it claimed to have in the first place under the Articles of the Constitution, but which politically, I don't think anybody was willing to push in the wake of tribal power. But suppose the water source is not below the ground, but above ground, and suppose that it flows through a territory. Then what? For example, there are water harvesting schemes that NURA was looking at. These were cisterns and small dams that would catch water, and this was all the craze in the 1990s. Build a water harvesting infrastructure so that whatever rain falls, you can then catch it, put it underground, and then figure out how are you going to divert it. These containers of water, the question would be, would they now be privately owned on the Sharia principle that once water is contained, it could actually be alienated from the commons, or could it be considered public property for which the state now is responsible, and could then be used for irrigation, which is supposed to benefit everybody in the community? So whatever water is not used for that purpose, the water surplus, could then be sold and diverted. This is obviously more complicated than in the case of groundwater, where one is dealing only with the owner's rights to the water beneath the land, and not with everybody else's right to the access of water on the surface of the land. And how that water is physically contained then raises the question of who owns it, right? And in turn, how ownership then would affect rights. In either case, whether groundwater or surface water, the water then has to be transported across lands owned by others, that is, who are not the original owners of the water, and they will have to be compensated. Also, they have no right to tamper with this transportation of water once it is contained and the state now owns that water, if that results in risking its quality or quantity. Not surprising, the NURA consultants advised working with well owners as much as possible, since they had private ownership of the water, an easier case than for water that was above ground and flowed across its surface. But there would be an ecological cost to this that I don't think anyone quite realized at the time, which was that you are now drawing down aquifers that were not being recharged because of the decades-long drought in Yemen. And so that solution, which seemed to be legally the least complicated, in the end became ecologically the most disastrous. But who would have thunk it at the time? And of course, now, because of a declining water table and the need of the cities to draw it from the hinterlands, but the hinterlands having less and less water that it could sell or reasonably have alienated from it through these water transfers, political conflict was inevitable, and it did, and in fact did occur. And you have the state now having to intervene between municipalities and tribal groups that are claiming that they're not being adequately compensated for their water. And in fact, it is at this time then that the arguments in Yemen shift really dramatically from a rights question to an equity question. Once these transfers have been effected, how do you commensurate the value of your water, which you're alienating not only from common use now, but also from future generations? How do you make that value commensurate with an exchange of goods and services or even money that you're receiving on that water, that surplus water over time, right? And these are obviously not, there are no easy or straightforward answers to these questions of commensurate value and therefore equity and justice. And these were what the fights were over. It wasn't so much that water per se was scarce. Yes, it was scarce in some places, but these water transfers were designed so that surplus, which at that time thought to exist, that surplus could then be transferred to people who could really need that surplus. But then how do you compensate people in exchange? And that becomes an equity issue.
Can I ask a question? Who was managing those transfers? Was it happening at the
Noura.
tribe?
Noura was managing.
The agency.
Yeah.
And it was
It would manage it.
Okay.
Not manage it, manage it in quotation marks. Yeah. Well, anyway, because I mean, you know, you're facing this. These are these little nebbishes and these sweet but ineffectual nerds in Noura who are facing off all-powerful sheikhs. We're saying, bug off. What are you going to do about it? And Noura says, this is against the law. You violated the law. And the sheikh said, so what? What are you going to do about it, right? And so ultimately it becomes a question for the military or for the police to intervene. And in Yemen, that means political capital. Are you, as the president or the governor, going to intervene against a powerful sheikh to resolve an equity issue when this is going to cost you politically? And more often than not, no.
And it was because the sheikhs would have the water. This was water that was being captured from
They
the stream on their property.
they
and
would
being
they would
diverted.
change their minds and say, look, the compensation you provided is no longer adequate, so we're stopping this transfer. We don't care if they're contractual agreements. These agreements were falsely represented, whatever. And you know, these were contestable in courts. They weren't just simply the sheikh ripping it up and saying, you know, bug off. They were actually court cases, and the consultants were aware that Noura could be entangled in endless litigation that would, in effect, stop the system. So this is why they're so anxious about what are the legal implications of this and how do we manage this to avoid that, or to have as little of this kind of litigation as possible. So, but of course, litigation again is often a matter of who has the most bucks. These sheikhs often, were able to rewrite the agreements to better serve themselves and their own constituencies. It was not only their own wealth or power that was at stake.
I was there in the 80s in the Peace Corps, and I was in the Ministry of Municipalities and Housing, and they were trying to build low-income housing and rebuild these sheikhs have AK-47s. They have men and guards, and a surveyor could be out laying a road or a water pipe, and they're there. No, this isn't happening here. And the work stops, and it stops for months. So all of that's going on. It's chaos, and people in the ministry and the water, everybody's affected by money and being bought off, and that kind of thing is going on. So it's very hard. This wasn't, maybe things have changed, but in my day, you just couldn't get past these things. The sheikhs had an incredible amount of power in the villages.
Yeah.
They really run the parliament and the president.
Well, yes, that's a very stark view, because also, the president was famous for being able to turn one sheikh against the other.
Yeah, he's skilled.
And therefore, in a way, get his own way or get the state's way willy-nilly. It's not as if they were all in thrall. I think that the question really became at what point, and literally, when you're dealing with problems of this scale, it does require the president to intervene. And can you imagine if the president intervenes in every little conflict? Forget about it. So he or she, will be a he, I'm sure, has to weigh those decisions very, very carefully. And in most instances, the president did not intervene. He said, settle it locally. I cannot be bothered with this. Settle it locally.
And what were the water transfers being used for? Was it for domestic drinking water? And were there scarcity in certain places as a result of these kinds of interruptions?
They were mainly for drinking, yes. This was to address the shortage of water that the municipalities faced. So this was really basics that they were addressing. It was not to use water for, plastics industry or something that would go into the pockets of private entrepreneurs. They would buy up water resources and then have them trucked to their plants. And oftentimes these were polluting operations in which the polluted water would be diverted onto someone else's land, and they would say, what, clean it up? This is, make me do it. This is against the law. No, it's against the law. Make me do it. So, this is a different instance of war. But this is, everywhere the case. The person, the big man, if they have nothing but their self-interest in mind and no sense of communal obligation, will get away with this. And it was only in the 2000s that you had an environmental movement of sorts developing in which violators of this sort that were contaminating willfully and consciously contaminating water supply were being hauled up in court.
I was going to ask, do the sheikhs themselves, do they see themselves as primarily part of a nation state, a national community, and do they see this as do they identify primarily with the other people in their tribe or a particular region and are kind of thinking, we don't want to get involved? Why should we have to go ahead and sacrifice ourselves for this national project or this national identity that perhaps we don't disagree with, though perhaps we aren't even invested in, and perhaps think centralization in and of itself is a problematic political goal? Or do they see themselves as kind of like, yes, we're signed on and we see ourselves as Yemeni and this is a great thing, but we just want to negotiate the proper amount of compensation?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question. So, some people argue that tribes are like states. They're interest groups, and they have their own laws, and they have their own administrations. They have their own territories. They set up treaties with other tribes. They are sovereign entities, very much like nations are. And you don't see nations as being particularly transcendent above their own national parochial interests, right? I mean, occasionally we do, but
But it seems like it
rare.
kind of fits on how we look at the question, because for instance, if some other country other than the United States said, for instance, share in the water problems and you say no, this is one nation's resources and perhaps not
Right.
another. But if one frames the question, I'm not saying you're doing this at all, but that these are these kind of like sheikhs and why are they being so obstructive and what?
Well, look, I mean, the Nora, I mean, the answer is that yes, there are, tribes do have transcendent visions of themselves as national subjects that go beyond the parochial borders of the tribe. You saw this most recently in the Arab Spring in Yemen, where hundreds of thousands of tribesmen laid down their arms at the doorsteps of the university and marched with fellow Yemenis in solidarity for a common goal, which was to bring down a government that by this time had very little legitimacy and to work towards a transformed order. There were also many tribes who stood on the sidelines waiting it out to see who would, after the shake-up, bad pun, who would end up holding the cards, and therefore they would now be dealing with this person. And so they kept on the sidelines. There was no sense here of a national transcendent vision. This was, it'll be the same old thing, except a different dealer, a different set of cards, a different set of players. Once we know the game, we'll put our chips in and see how we fare, right? So there are different answers to this, but the interesting thing about this document is that they knew, these writers knew, that there was no reason necessarily for tribes to agree to these water transfers, especially if they were skeptical because they didn't trust the state to compensate them equitably. So they knew there had to be moral suasion that would get them to part with their resources. And for them, the moral suasion was, look, you are good, pious Muslims. You know as well as we do what the Sharia says. The Sharia says, if someone is in dire need of water, it is a sin if you have a surplus of water to deny it to them, right? And in this case, we're talking about cities that are in dire need with citizens going without water for days on end. Therefore, it is your obligation to part with that water to people who are your strangers, in effect, who are not your tribe. You have no political power over them, but you feel morally obligated to them as fellow Muslims, right? And in many cases it worked, except when the sheikhs or someone else would say, but the cities have badly mismanaged their water. You're asking us, we are very good managers of our water, and you're asking us to now, throw good water to bad users and therefore compound the problem. So, sometimes they backed off from that deal and said, I may be relieving the water the person who, of thirst, they need water, but, am I going to have to do it again and again and again? Because the system is so bad that it can't be fixed, right? And this is a problem for you, the state. Now when we need you, you come in, fix their water problems, finally, so that we don't have to continually transfer the water to the cities. So these are, they're incredibly complicated moral, political questions that very few people have actually studied. In fact, no one has really studied in the depth that they deserve to be. Let me just, by way of conclusion, say that by the time the consultants were done with their investigation, they realized that there were so many inconsistencies in these applications of these different legal systems, so many ambiguities, and in one glaring case, a seemingly direct contradiction of the Constitution, that an actual water law needed to be passed, and Muhammad al-Iryani became a key figure in helping, along with legal experts, to draft this water law, which came into being in 2002, and which is actually a very good water law. I have not studied that water law carefully, especially in light of this previous history, to see to what extent it was actually dealing with this question. And it has since been amended because of all the loopholes that appeared, that people were only too clever in exploiting. The issue remains, however, whether this very good water law can be implemented, because this is again a political question. And who has the will to face off powerful people who, in the end, are violating the law for their own narrow self-interests? And there are always such people.
How much of the influence, the impetus for creating this new water law came from inside versus outside? Because you see a trend across the Middle East, and actually in many parts of the world, but in particular in the Middle East, where there had been this idea of fragmented laws is common in many parts of the world, including the U.S., and that there was a push to try and consolidate into frameworks. And I'm wondering, it sounds like in Yemen it was very much an organic internal process. I'm wondering if there was any external.
I think not. I think it was both. I think it was both internal. Yemen has a great legal tradition, and also I think international experts, particularly the Dutch, were saying that it was necessary for the civil law to be reformed. So they provided expert legal counsel for the Yemeni government to rewrite the law and then have it passed through parliament. So it was a combination of these two. What is remarkable is that the same international order in the 1990s was only too happy to expand Yemen's water reserves without a legal framework in place, which led to all kinds of irresponsible water drilling that actually flat out contradicted these principles of 500-meter distance between wells and things like that. And that had catastrophic results. So it was rather late in the day that the international order said, well, now it's time to have a water law. By that point, the damage was so great that it's almost... So, I guess let me end by saying the thing that irritates me the most about the way in which Western pundits like Thomas Friedman and other Western experts talk about Yemen is that the blame is put squarely on either the Yemeni people because they're primitive got chewers who are, using up the water supply for a drug that does nobody any good. And if only we could get rid of this scourge, we would be able to save 60% of the water supply, which then could be diverted to socially beneficial uses. Which is crap, because, one reason that got expansion has occurred in recent years is that the other cash crop economy collapsed in the face of a rapidly diminishing water supply that the development community in the 90s contributed to, right? So the other way in which Yemen is blamed is its government. It's inefficient, it's corrupt, it's incompetent, all of which is actually true, but it doesn't mean that the Yemeni government wasn't actually striving mightily to address these issues in really serious terms. And this document that I presented to you is an example of it, right? So, what government isn't corrupt, inefficient, and what's the other term? Corrupt, inefficient, and incompetent. My God, that defines every government that we know. This is not helpful at all, and it doesn't distinguish Yemen from any government. So what is there about the particularities of this government that it faces, which may make the challenges of its water situation particularly difficult? And that to me is a more helpful way of framing the question. So I'm coming into this workshop kind of out of the blue, and I don't know if the way I've framed the issues on water rights has been helpful or even it seems intelligible to you from your very intelligent questions. So
yeah, no, I think on behalf of all of us, I could say this has been a great lecture, and some of the issues you've touched on I've studied in my own work.
Right.
So I think one thing that's interesting that we've wrestled with in this study group is even the distinction when you say rights, what does that even mean? And so human rights really come from the international legal framework of human rights and really are neutral in terms of how you implement them and from the standpoint of policy. When you talk about water and sanitation as human rights, it doesn't necessarily, it's actually a distinct issue from water rights as which are coming from the property legal regime that you were touching on. And it was interesting because when you look in a domestic context, they sort of mesh back and forth, and it's really interesting thinking of how much actually Sharia principles around the right of thirst and some of the other principles you talked about are the same debates that you're seeing happening in a secular way in the human rights realm. And even in some of the, all of these issues that are, as you point out, are not black and white in terms of separating, even the question around, there's various trends to how do we promote better management of water. So separating water from the land so you could trade it. Or this question of, what was the word? Containing water. Even just last week we were talking about why water's not a classic public good. It's because it's excludable and rivalrous. And so if I consume it, it's going to impact you. And, so I think all of the issues that you've touched on are things that we have been grappling with in terms of, but thinking about them also in other parts of the world where you don't have the Islamic overlay, but you may have things like in Bolivia, uso y costumbres, so uses and customs and indigenous practices that might be compatible with a commons form, and that's where I make the distinction between the state and the commons. So.
Yeah, right. Well, I think an anthropologist like me would have difficulty knowing on what grounds one even can talk about human rights in this universalist sense, right? It comes out of a humanistic tradition that is very much tied to a certain history and a certain religion, in fact. it makes it more difficult, in my view, to see that there are these older traditions that have wrestled with this question of right. Haq in Arabic is one of the most resonant words you can imagine. I mean, in Yemeni Arabic, there's an expression, hada hagaka, hagana. Hagana, it belongs, remember that? Hagana, hagi, hagak. Does it belong to you? Does it belong to me? So ownership and right become clearly connected, right? Hukuk, rights, is a resonant term in Islamic discourse, and it's all over Urf. And these are really old discourses that are quite elaborate. So does one say that this is separate from a human rights discourse because the latter has emerged out of its own tradition and history? How does one generalize human rights discourse in an intelligible way so that it is in dialogue with these other traditions without overpowering them and subsuming them under it, you know? So those are obviously interesting questions as
Yeah.
well.
I also thought it was interesting during your talk, at one point you said, now we're moving from rights to equity.
Mhm.
And I think if you're thinking in a strictly property as, rights as property sense, you see
Right.
how those would be
Mhm.
at odds. But if you think about rights as also human rights, equity is
Yeah.
fundamentally part of that.
Right, right. Yes, I think that in this instance, the Yemenis would say, well, it's clearly right, these rights are clearly recognized. How they are realized, however, is a practical political question, and that is a question of equity. Have you in fact realized this that is commensurate in value to what I'm giving you? So it's more a notion of equity in terms of exchange value rather than rights value.
But in terms of equity, what's interesting is certain things like in human rights discourse, we often focus on South Africa as having a basic free water policy. Another word for that might be a lifeline. But in my reading, Iran, for example, has had a policy like this of providing a certain amount of free water for people, but you don't necessarily see that coming up so much in the human rights literature because it seems like has just been part of the culture from the Islamic traditions.
I'm interested to know that the human rights literature then does deeply engage the question of water, right?
It's, in the last decade.
In the last decade,
Yeah.
right. Now it's the security discourse that's overtaking water. You know, it's a question of national security, that Yemen secure its water resource for its population, and so it's amazing to me that how quickly this has happened, with breathtaking speed it's happening. And so now the terms of the discussion are shifting radically.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I'm just curious about North and South Yemen, and maybe what I only know North
Yes,
Yemen,
right.
so what did South Yemen bring with its British protectorate?
In
to
terms of
this
water?
Table, right.
Well, it didn't, the British really didn't muck around with the local water system. That was pretty much set and pretty successful. They did modernize the water delivery system in Aden. And so I think maybe even the first desalination plant in the peninsula was installed by the British in Aden. But that was to secure the water for their own troops, for the colonial administration, and not so much for the general urban population. But what the South brings to the table is an ocean of water underneath it. And so this is another thing when someone like Friedman echoes the common mantra about Yemen that it might be the first society on earth to run out of water. What does that mean, for God's sake, right? So in fact, Hadramaut, which is the largest wadi in Arabia and historically a very important one, has an ocean of water underneath it. And a relatively sparse population by comparison to other water-stressed regions in the country. Hadramaut also has now most of the oil. So it is sitting on enormously important resources, and it is saying we want to possibly secede from this union because you are not the North, you are not, this is an equity issue. We're giving you these resources and you're not compensating us adequately for them. But how do you transfer that water? Again, you simply can't pump it to the highlands. And given the politically fraught situation now in South Yemen, you can't really sort of say, well, you know, Northerners, why don't you migrate to our lands? We'll be happy to set you up. And we'll relieve the water stress situation. Forget about it. I mean, they're now arch enemies. So, you know, potentially the South could be could go a long way to help relieve the water stress, but politically, it's not going to happen. You should go back.
I'd love
And since you and I couldn't go to the South when we were there, now it's open and it's just glorious. We really missed out on something when we couldn't cross that border because it was a so-called communist state. Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very
All
much.
right.